Good afternoon to everyone. Good afternoon, Father President Yap. Thank you for inviting me here um, for a sharing session with trustees, officers, and members of the Ateneo community. I'm Dina Ocampo from the UP College of Education. I'm very pleased and honored to be given this opportunity to share with you my thoughts on basic education at this time. The title that was given to me for discussion is Multiple Tiers, Multiple Markets, the Structure and Character of Philippine Basic Education. I'm discussing this in three parts. One is on tiers, one is on markets, and the third and final one will be on issues and some potential solutions. In this presentation, tiers are regarded as levels in a structure or organization. And more importantly, I'd like us to keep in mind that they can be levels of importance. In basic education, let me share with you that there are, for me, at least two types of tiers. The first type are the tiers of governance. In this slide, you will see four, four sets of tiers. Starting from the bottom here, this would be the organizational chart or the tiers that may be found in a school. So this is from Barangka National High School, which was openly available in the internet. Higher or on than schools would be schools divisions. And this would be a set of offices within the Department of Education that now govern schools at a particular geographic area. So, for example, um, Marikina would be with one geographic area, and therefore Barangka would be part of the schools division of Marikina, headed by a superintendent, and within that office of the superintendent are other offices governing schools divisions and schools are regional offices. And regional offices headed by a regional director now have um, policy making functions, and they have their own purview. For example, the curriculum people within a regional office must coordinate with the curriculum people within schools division, and then also must coordinate with how curriculum is implemented and taught and learned, more importantly, in schools. And then obviously this connects to the central office of the Department of Education. And in this central office, you will see a huge number of boxes, so many tiers, so many levels, because there are so many concerns that the Department of Education has to pay attention to. So within the Department of Education, these four little pictures over here, these give us an idea of the tiers of governance within the DepEd. The blue arrows show you the the relationship, but the red arrow tells us the direction of the relationship on most occasions. I will talk about this a little bit more, but obviously the red arrow tells us that it's very top down as an institution. Policies are issued from the central office, reiterated by regional and schools divisions until they reach the schools. But this is a figure that I'd like you to keep in mind because I'll be going back to it later. The other side of the DepEd functions has to do with the private sector. And the voice or the partner usually of the DepEd is the Private Education Assistance Committee, created long ago by an executive order, if I'm not mistaken, in the 1968. No, yeah, it's here. It's 1968, and it is headed by the Secretary of Education, and there are representatives from NEDA, from organizations like SEAP, AXCU, and PACU. And they are supposed to handle a fund, which is an assistance fund for private education. And, if you're not familiar with the PAYAC, this was actually the brainchild and advocated for by three Jesuits. And so this is very important for the private sector because PAYAC has established itself in as a conduit between the Department of Education and private schools. It has corresponding offices, so to speak. So central office has the National Secretariat of PEAC, the regional offices of the Department of Education, which are in charge of private education. Usually, these are the FTAD or the Quad or Quality Assurance Division or technical assistance divisions of the regional offices would have counterparts within PEAC called regional secretariats. And then the division, school governance and operations division at the schools divisions level would now be connected to the schools of PEAC. Now, these are tiers of governance. Then there are tiers of curriculum. And I think this is very interesting. I'm a curriculum person myself, no? And I think that these are important in looking at how education is constructed, conceptualized in our country. So the K to 12 has K to 3, which is key stage 1, 4 to 6 as key stage 2, junior high school or grade 7 to 10 as key stage 3, and grades 11 and 12 as key stage 4. Now these key stages they culminate in grade 12 in the Philippine qualifications framework. Some of the grade 12 students will probably already have competencies that will qualify them to take the national competency exams for the TESDA. So in the PQF, the articulations have to be about knowledge, skills, and values, application, and degrees of independence. Knowledge, skills, and values for grades 10 and grades 12 are differentiated, as well as their application and the degrees of independence. I'll just talk about the degrees of independence because I think this is the shortest and we only have limited time for this afternoon. But the PQF standard is that in conditions where there is very close support, guidance, supervision, minimum judgment or discretion is needed. So that is a standard of degrees of independence. For grade 10, the DepEd standard is apply skills in limited situation with close supervision. And then for grade 12, apply skills in varied situations with minimal supervision. This is important for grades 10 and 12 because it articulates for the department what should be achieved at a certain point. Now, because education is a process of continuous reconstruction of experience, it's very important for us to think about questions like what experiences are these? Whose experiences are we talking about? How do we look at these experiences? Are they unique? Are they shared? No, these questions come up just because of this very loaded statement. And in education, every statement is really loaded. That's why it's important to be able to understand the structure of the curriculum. We have kindergarten to grade 6, which is really for learning the skills needed to learn and to learn content that is necessary for subsequent learning. So when they get to junior high school, um, they need to be able to learn higher level mathematics, higher level science, and it becomes even more complex when they get to senior high school because in senior high school it is a hybrid of congested in junior high school and spread into senior high school, but also what was brought down from college and TESDA to go into senior high school. So senior high school is actually an integration of DepEd's basic ed curriculum, some of TESDA's curriculum, and some of higher ed curriculum. And that's why it is so diverse. And that diversity is, again, another important point I'd like you to hold on to. There are three types of education: the formal, the informal, and the non formal. We're all familiar with the formal. The informal is what happens incidentally in our homes, with our friends together. Every time we interact with somebody, we are actually going through some sort of informal education. Non-formal education is can be structured, can be a little bit it's loose or less structured, but there is always a purpose, and it is far more flexible than formal education. If you notice, there's an infinity sign that I have put to connect these three types of education. It's very important for us to know that they are not mutually exclusive. And again, this is a key concept that I think is important for all educationists to remember and to reflect on when looking at how education is implemented. Um, the integration of formal, informal, and non-formal education gives our students, all our students of different ways of learning, who have different preferences for learning and interests, a place in a school or in a learning situation. Finally, I'd like to share that within basic education, in the tiers of curriculum, it's also important to see that the formal and the non-formal, they have to intersect, no? And what are the systems that allow them to intersect? So even if they are conceptually different, they target different learners. For example, in formal education, we target school age children from 5 to 18. The alternative learning system will target children from 6 to 99 or even more, but who haven't had basic education or haven't completed basic education. So the alternative learning system or non-formal education must be able to to bring children either back to school if they are young children, or if they are older and or they need to work, then at least get their qualifications recognized. And that's why it's important that the formal and non-formal sectors or systems interact with each other, because through curriculum standards, through assessment frameworks or assessments, so that all the students or learners who are participant in these systems can acquire the the outcomes and the competencies that are envisioned for all completers of basic education, all graduates of basic education. So now I go to the second part, which would be markets. What are markets? No, they are groups who might be interested to buy what is being sold. Usually, we call them the customer. Or a market is also a business or a trade of a particular product, right? Or a place where products are sold. But the first and most important person in the education discussion is the learner. In strategy lingo, they would call them the customers. They are the ultimate beneficiaries of any education intervention. In the Philippines, I have some data here from the Department of Education. I was lucky enough to be able to ask a friend for some information, and you can see that over the years, the number of children participating in basic education have increased. No, unfortunately, if you look at 2020 to 2021, we actually lost 3 million children, or 2.5 million children, basically. And they aren't in school now in this school year. And this is obviously because of the pandemic. And so it's important for us to be able to think of ways to bring them back to school, to find them. Where are they? No? Because they are our customer. They are our most important participant in the education process. They are why we are here. Now, to get to learners, we need to understand their context. So, the second tier within the market would be schools and communities. Learners come with families, and families live in communities, and communities host schools and learning centers. I think that has to be very clear. Um, a school does not spring out of nowhere, right? A school has to be interactive with its venue, its community. And in the Philippines, the DILG as well as the NEDA, they have a classification system of rural, partially rural, and urban communities. And I have here on this slide just to share with you the distribution of Philippine schools, both public and private, that are rural, partially urban and urban communities. And you will see that majority of the schools are in partially urban communities. Now, this is the percentage of the national budget that is given to education. Um, in the discussion of any market, I suppose we need to talk about money and finances. And I just wanted to show you a couple of slides on this matter. First of all, uh, the DepEd budget is the orange line, and the national budget is the blue line. And at the very bottom, the light gray line is the percentage of the national budget that is given to the Department of Education. As you can see here, that from 2010 to 2017, the percentage of the national budget that is provided for education has been basic education has been increasing, was increasing. Then it started to taper down and become lower from 2017 onwards. For 2020, I think 2021, I think, has to do with some of the budget being diverted towards COVID response. But we're not supposed to have lesser money put into education. We should have more money being put into education. We are very far from the recommended 5 to 6% of the GDP for education. We're very far from that. And so we shouldn't really be removing money from the DepEd. Most of Philippine schools, as a matter of fact, 76.5% of Philippine schools are run by the government. Only 23% are run by private schools. And this 23%, they only teach 8.9% of the student population. So though there are many private schools, they don't cover 25% of learners. Now, what is the amount of government funds that is provided to the private sector? Oh, I failed to say earlier, if I can just go back, that in in 2017, the budget of the DepEd was around 568 billion, right? So if we think about that and go back to this slide, we can see that the percentage of the DepEd budget that goes to private education is roughly about 5% or so. And so 5% of 500 billion is 25 billion pesos. This is the amount of money that is given to the private sector through the service contracting ESC, GASPE, and of course the senior high school voucher program. If there were stronger or presence of the private sector, then I think that the amounts that would we put forward from government to the private sector would also increase. Now, the other thing that we need to think about in terms of markets is how the futurists or future thinkers are predicting to be the global trends for the next 20, 30 years. No? The nine mega trends, the global mega trends that are seen, for example, are changing demographics. It is expected that the demographics all over the world will be aging. That, of course, is the reverse in the Philippines. In the Philippines, we are very young population, right? The second mega trend has to do with the rise of the individual. So more and more people are choosing what suits themselves better, right? And so this rise of the individual will have impact on a lot of services. Then obviously technology is a major driver in the now and in the future. And they are also interconnected and emerging economies that need to be identified or imagined now so that the education sector can produce the graduates needed for these economies. There's also a discussion on public debt, resource stress, climate change, and I think very important and is seen by Philippine data is the fast urbanization of places. So urban centers now, big cities are becoming mega cities, but then smaller cities are emerging. At the same time, it's also important to look at local development plans. I would like to share with you, this is an old photo, you know. This was from the time I was still in DepEd, so that's a good 4 years ago. But I'd like to share with you one of the municipalities in Bicol, which is Daraga. And what they did was to actually determine, together with their municipal board, their regional development council, and all of that, what would be the industries that are needed in the next 10 years, 5 years. And because of that, they were able to decide on how many, for example, STEM classes to offer in senior high school, how many ABM, how many humanities and social sciences, how many how many general academic strands, what sort of TVL courses needed to be offered, arts and design and sports. And so they were able to identify what schools would offer these, so that they could answer or address the the preferences of students, families, and community members in terms of the manpower, the skills, the woman power that they need for making their places progressive economically. So local development plans are very important. This is the third part of my presentation. I'm sorry, I'm going very fast because I'd like to finish within time. So, one of the things that we need to talk about is supply and demand in education. Okay. Now, supply and demand is very important to think about because supply driven education delivery has been the paradigm for so long. You know, education was first constructed by the elite, you know, princes and princesses, kings and queens had individualized education, but this was reserved for people of that stature. For everyone else, we participated in general public education. And in supply driven education delivery, what happens is that we we intend to reach as many people as possible. And so the tendency is to make this constant, make this like a product, for example, that you make it replicable everywhere, right? And so what happens is that teachers and learners really have no control about what they learn, where they learn it, when they learn it, how they learn it, and from whom they learn it. Government provided standards, instructional materials, facilities, teacher competencies, and all of these requirements. But the Philippines, you know, the Philippines really dove deep into supply driven education. Why? Because there's just so many of us, really. And that the archipelago is so diverse that it was really, in the beginning, easier to put up schools or learning centers that already had packaged programs. And this is not a bad thing. It had to be done. No, it had to be done at that time. Unfortunately, because it was seen as a packaged product, it is very vulnerable to political intervention. So you can have politicians or people who want to be politicians saying, I brought education to you, as if education were in a basket, and this basket had everything you needed to be able to learn, you know. And so the power of bringing education to somebody, to delivering it like as if it were a package or mail, right? um this made education constrained, and it made it fixed in shape and form. And so that now made it supply driven. You just give whatever it is you constructed. Yeah. So the character of that kind of education is that it is assimilative. You know, you get people to buy into that thinking. This is how you solve a problem. This is how you answer your teacher. Opo, yes po, di ba? Good morning, visitor. You know, it's formulaic, right? It's for convergence. It's there's one way to do things. It's a delivery mode. It's inflexible, and it's one size fits all. On the other hand, is demand driven education programs. Now, this shifts in learning theories from behaviorist learning theories to learning, social constructivist learning theories, and now interactive ones, no? Machine human interactions, even defining how learning theories are changing. These now will create shifts in learning environments and in learning interactions. The shift of power and decision making is also impending from teacher to student, from central to local. Remember, I told you about remembering the red line, the red arrow. That is a shift. That arrow should be at the very least double headed, or that arrow should be shorter, that arrow should the blue arrow should be more cyclical, and things like that, no? Those arrows that are so hard and fast, they should probably have more rounded corners, right? So that it shows more dynamism rather than being boxy like that. In demand driven education, I think it's very important to remember that technology is a major driver. And I'm not talking about high tech, I'm talking about the way learning modules that are on print are designed. Now, what is the character of demand driven education? First and foremost, I think it is both for convergence and divergence. Divergence being the new element. Second, very important, it is evidence based. In other words, it's data driven. Want to know what children want to learn. You want to know what this group wants to learn. And this is very important for indigenous peoples. It's very important for for populations that require assistive technologies. For example, the deaf who might need hearing aids, or the blind who might need braille. These are important, no? Um, to address locally. And this is the third point, is that it should be inclusive. Demand driven education programs are necessarily learner centered, and therefore there has to be a place for every learner in a school or a learning community. Differentiated instruction is another character of demand driven education programs. So this is very, very different from supply driven. And to move from supply driven to demand driven is a journey, a major journey that we all need to traverse and do together. So what are issues? Equity is an issue. This is my number one issue, as a matter of fact, no? In supply driven programs or education, there's, the objective is access to education for all. But the fact is that access to education for all leaves only one and only one option for the poor. Whereas demand driven can also be available for all, but usually it's only those who can afford to make choices avail of demand driven options. So we need to revolutionize the only option and reboot it on both the curriculum and governance tiers, so that public schools, which is where most of our children attend school, become more inclusive, become more learner centered. Um, Obviously, as you saw by the numbers, the private sector is still small and is still catering to less than 3 million students. I think it's very important to reboot things in the public sector, so that the poor who have really no choice but to study in the one school in their community, because it's the only school up there, that school has to be of such quality that they will be happy to study there. So therefore, every school must have inclusion programs, must have programs for the learning disabled, for the dyslexic, for the child with autism, for children with physical difficulties or disease, no, battling disease, children who have behavioral issues. These inclusion programs must be present. Second, is quality. Another issue is quality. In supply driven education, it's usually unidimensional. Achievement is the only lens. Policy is centralized and rigid. If you go the pendulum swing, because it's also not okay to do a major pendulum swing, no, to demand driven education, outcomes and standards based. Ganyan na naman ng K to 12. We are already doing this, no? But there are various ways to observe and record achievement. So, what are these various ways? And then policy is local and evidence based. So, there is a need to define quality at the present time. So, we need to use learner, community, and school level data more. And policies on flexibility and inclusion should be clear. For example, it should be clear that we govern schools and school systems for learning, and we assess for improved governance programs and teaching. So we assess children for learning, but that's for their purpose, right? But on a policy level, on a school or education leadership level, we assess for improved governance programs and teaching. And that's very important distinction. Third is voice. Whose voice are we listening to? In supply driven, it's only one voice, two voices, three voices. In demand driven, many voices are heard. Of course, this can lead to anarchy and chaos. So it's very important to put a system of decision making and responsibility in the tiers of governance. For example, let learners and families decide on content and processes based on consultations with teachers and supervisors. So even in the Ateneo, this is something that can be done. There's a lot of FGDs, a lot of consultations with learners and families on what they are learning. Give them a voice in that process. And then convert these to goals, their ideas into goals. And then crosswalk these ideas to the standard set in the curriculum. What I mean by crosswalk is to match them. So let's say children want to learn more about coding, let's say. So where in the curriculum does coding fall? Is that in practical arts? Is that in mathematics? Is that in science? Where does it fall? So find the match. It doesn't have to be a match in one subject. It can be a match in several. But that's important. Fourth, we need to dig deep. Who are we? What is our identity? Whose voice is that? Is that the voice of our culture? Is that the voice of aspiration? Is that the voice of the parent? You know, in senior high school planning, we could hear the voice of parents very loud, louder than the voices of learners. And it's because of aspiration. Families wanting to get out of poverty. And this was a very important consideration. Fourth, we need to gaze outward. Again, what are those trends? Is a particular community already partially urban? Then what program should be present in that community as it transitions? How can we prepare children for who are 10 years old now for jobs that will be available when they are 25? How do we do that? So we need to gaze outward, look at the trends, which is in the last few slides. In supply driven, again, trends are determined by policymakers, trends are determined by curriculum writers. It's very hard to transform these trends and revise. Um, Most of you know this, but I'm one of those who refuses to support any initiative to put curriculum into the language of the law. You just don't do it because you can't change it if it's in the law. In demand driven education, the danger is we flop a lot, no? Oh, this is a trend, let's do it. But then without the proper monitoring and progress evaluation, we don't know if it's working or not. So uso programs that don't take root are dangerous programs. So that's the challenge there. How do you balance that? So again, It's important to have a long view of community, local, and global trends. That long view is needed. And so curriculum should serve the community and the people by having good basis for developing or institutionalizing programs. Governance should enable synergy and cooperation among members of the community. And number one for me is that the school's core business must always be top of mind. And if I may add, it should always be the one enacted, the core business. It's not the fiesta, it's not the contest, it's not even palarong pambansa. The core business is for students to learn, to love learning, to discover who they are, to serve the community, and so on. That's the core business, is to learn. And that's what they should be spending their time on. There are a few trends in education that are coming up. For example, they're changing goals. Um, what should graduates know and be able to do? There's active learning. I mean, I don't know why this is new because John Dewey said this in the early 1920s yata or 30s. Why what is so new about active learning? That's very important, no? Competency is what to show what you can do with what you know. The Philippines is doing it through micro credentialing, yung mga NC1 natin, NC2, NC3, NC4. These are credentials. And these are credentials that higher education need to pick up on. And number four, integrated support. So we need more support for parents and learners using face-to-face, ICT mediated, and apps. No? And the OECD very recently, I just had to add this, no? Had post 2020 scenarios about schools. They have five. One is school. They have four, no? Nadagdag ko lang tong EdTech, no? Now they have four. One is schools are extended. Um, you know, more of the same. There's a slow change. Second, there's education outsourced, meaning you choose. You select what app are you going to do. Blink, are you going to do Coursera, are you going to enroll in these Harvard courses available online? This is mostly higher education option, I think. Schools as learning hubs, I think this is where we should go. School community partnerships where lifelong learning programs are available for everyone. Happy schools, action research as basis for curricular and governance changes. Children have a voice in these changes. There's a flexible curriculum and flexible process. These are now necessary for interventions at school levels or schools division levels, no? um, or learn as you go is their fourth option. Learning on demand, digital, artificial intelligence already, no, um, serving as teachers. Schools are replaced by virtual environments, more home based. Again, these are probably for older learners. Then I added edtech. Edtech is a driver. It is going to be a driver for all four because mobile learning technologies are going to be used more. Even if we get the vaccine, even if we are able to open up our schools again, what we've done through blended and remote learning, we should be able to bring back into schools so that instead of the rigid classroom setups with 30, 40 children in rows and columns, we probably need to devise learning nooks. We should help children transition. I mean, they were learning alone for so long. Then we need to bring them to communities of learners within their classes, within their schools, rather than bringing them back to desks and solo learning that might make them feel even more isolated. So I think we should leverage edtech when we can. So these are post 2020 scenarios about schools that OECD put forward. I think that these are these are exciting times ahead for basic education. Uh, what are the tiers and markets that we will respond to and that we will address? No? What are the issues that arise from these tiers and markets that have to be thought about for more reform? We need to study the data about reforms that were instituted and look at how we can push further the quality of education and the quality of learning. The Ateneo has to reflect on how it will engage with communities and what communities will it engage with. There's there are opportunities to engage on a national level, but there are exciting opportunities to engage at local and school level or community levels, which I think are going to be potentially powerful. Um, how can Ateneo in its own community become more inclusive, uh, not only of the genders but also of abilities? How can the Ateneo show the rest of the private school sector how it transitions to become that kind of learning community? I think this is a very exciting question for the Ateneo to reflect on. Um, what are the footholds that you will maintain, and what are the areas that you will pioneer in? And I think that the tiers and the markets that I described, they are there. They are there for us to understand, to appreciate, to value, but also to improve on and to interact with. And with this, no, I hope that there is sufficient information for you to ponder and to reflect on the ways forward for the Ateneo community. So thank you very much. These are my references. Again, I appreciate the opportunity to interact with you. Thank you for the invitation, and ingat, ingat po tayong lahat.